Welcome to the first episode of a series I like to call So You Want to Learn Game Design. In each one, we're going to focus on a specific genre and what you should take away from the major do's and don'ts if you want to make one for yourself. And what better genre to begin with than the one that has the most examples of it out there, and that is going to be 2D platforming. 2D platformers is a genre that at this point, if we count all the fan games, Kaizo hacks, Mario makers, Mega Man makers, all the makers out there, has the most examples of any genre to date. It's why I put my first game design deep dive book on that genre, shameless plug here. But it's also a genre that can be used as kind of the testbed or foundation for other genre combinations. Action-adventure, platforming horror, platforming puzzle games, and many more. But with all these examples out there, it's also a genre that I think a lot of people severely underrate the difficulty and the complexity that goes into designing a good 2D platformer. And I've already recorded the back half of this video, and this is going to be already a very long one. And we're not going to be talking about Metroidvanias or 3D platformers, as they are their own topics, and I don't want to make like a 10-hour long video just on the nature of platforming. So the reason why you want to study 2D platformers is that platforming in itself is one of the more reflex-driven examples of design. Up there, of course, with the whole shooter genre. If you can learn how to make a really good platformer, you'll also learn how to make games that feel really good in the player's hands. We've talked a lot about how Nintendo has managed to make just the simple act of Mario jumping in an empty room, maybe on gray blocks, exciting and fun. And if you can do something similar in your game, then you're off to a very strong foot. But what makes platforming, and by extension reflex-driven design, so difficult is that this is something that is entirely operated by the player. There is no abstraction that factors into whether or not the player is going to enjoy the act of double jumping, ground stomps, running left and right. And if your game doesn't feel good to play, if the simple act of going up and down doesn't elicit some feeling of joy in the player, then literally everything else that's in your game has failed. It will not improve your title. And we have seen this with so many developers who have tried to think outside the box when it comes to their platforming. I'm going to make a platformer RPG. I'm going to make a platformer that is going to be more story-driven. And that is often a very easy trap I've seen designers fall into, is that they'll combine platforming with another genre, even platforming shooting or action shooting like in a Contra. And just going from left to right or making a jump, it feels bad. And when that feels bad, everything else in your game is basically non-existent. You have failed. And it's why platforming is very hard to do right. There is a very wide spectrum between bad, good, and masterclass examples of it. And it's why you need to play a lot of examples and study them as well. And that's another point for this series, that you need to play these games. There is this myth from a lot of developers who say, well, just watch a YouTube video, watch a streamer do a let's play of a game, and you'll get everything you need to know. And part of this episode, or part of this entire series, is to debunk that myth. You see, the problem is that watching footage is not enough to get you the feel of a game. And this is especially true of something that is reflex-driven. Here's a fun challenge. This is how you can drive any game developer crazy. Challenge them to recreate Super Mario World, but they are not allowed to play the game, touch a gamepad, or do any kind of interacting with it. All they can do is watch someone else play it. And as a really good point, some of you will probably be thinking, well, that doesn't sound so hard. But no, that is incredibly difficult to do. And the reason why is that you can study numbers. You can watch Mario go up and down. A character spin jump, triple jump, whatever kind of jumping you can imagine. But if you're not behind the controller or the keyboard, you're not going to understand how it feels to press a button and let your character do whatever kind of maneuver that they're going to do. And it's oftentimes why platforming, in of itself, is a genre that you either get it or you don't. And it's also another strong point about how a lot of indie developers have made a name for themselves with just one really standout platformer. And a lot of them are going to be mentioned later on in this video. Because understanding feel is not something you need to go to school. You don't need to take a master course to understand how it feels good to jump in a platformer. It's something that once you understand it, it becomes a lot easier to recreate it, to iterate on, and to refine it. It's also why for a lot of developers who go from like a major studio or working in other genres, that switching to something that is reflex driven without having a background in it is very hard to do. Like I said at the start, there are a lot of people who look down on 2D platforming as it's simple. It's very easy to do. It's old hat. It's something that has been refined and tested so many times that who cares? It's a novice genre to work in. But it is certainly not. And this is why you need to study all the examples, all the bad ones, good ones, and everything in between. Because feel is something that you have to learn why it works and why it doesn't work. And you're not going to get that simply by watching footage. And again, you can watch lots and lots of footage of 2D platforming, but understanding why this translates good, bad, and in between is a lot harder. As another thing that you'll learn from studying platformers is level design. Being able to build interesting and varied levels in a game. And again, this is not just about pure difficulty. Some people will think that good progression in a game like this is, well, level 1 is a 1 out of 10 in difficulty, level 15 is a 15 out of 10, and we just keep going up and up and up. But that's not what you want to do. You can do different level designs without making things noticeably harder. And some of the better platformers are about providing different environmental and enemy hazards. That's not just about making the platforming get ever closer to Kaizo level difficulty, but about introducing a new enemy or a new platform that you have to deal with. And then this becomes part of your tool set when it comes to designing more levels in it. And when you can learn this can be translated to some extent to anything that is going to be reflex driven. Like we've said earlier with the Metroidvanias and the 3D platformers. Earlier, I mentioned that you can drive a game developer crazy by having them recreate Super Mario World. But there's another way to drive any game designer mad. Ask them to make a fully functional and working 2D camera for a game. And this, my friends, is no small task. It's why when you're making a platformer, there are a lot of things, as we've said, as we're going to talk about later, that have to go right for it to work. One of the developers I follow on social media, they made a very challenging and very complicated turn-based roguelike. And then they decide for their next game they're going to make a 2D Mario-like. I remember seeing this on Twitter X a long time ago that they just had to vent about why is it so hard to make the camera work? Why can't I get this just right? I was just sitting there going, yeah, they probably didn't read my book on game design. Or again, it is so easy to go into the 2D platformer genre thinking that, well, I made a first-person shooter, or I made a very complicated RPG or JRPG. Why would I have any trouble making a character go left to right and jump? But yes, the camera is its own quagmire of Lovecraftian nightmares that, again, if you fail on in any way, shape, or form, it completely ruins your entire game and everything else that you've put into it. Very little pressure that I'm describing in this video. But that's it for kind of what we're going to be talking about, what you should be paying attention to. For the rest of this video, I'm going to be showing you examples of do's and don'ts when it comes to 2D platformers, and I am sure we're going to get a lot of comments down below for the picks that I've mentioned. But with that said, let's start with our first platforming do. It's very obvious at this point that we're going to talk about a do of 2D platforming, and we have to mention Mario. And while I haven't had a chance to play Super Mario Wonder yet, we can certainly go with a very, I'm sure, unknown Mario game, and that is Super Mario World. When it comes to 2D design, Super Mario World by far probably has the most examples, research, and games based off of it imaginable. And that's if we count the massive number of Kaizo games, Kaizo hacks, Super Mario World inspired levels in Mario Maker 1 and 2. This is a game that has inspired and has been the foundation for so many examples of 2D platforming. And it's important to understand why. Super Mario World is by no means the most complicated 2D platformer or the hardest one that you're going to see in this video. But what it does provide is a very engageable and very approachable set of tools and challenges for any player. Now, Nintendo has always been a studio that tries to kind of gate or segment the super expert, ultra difficult aspects of their design from the more casual or core audience. And Super Mario World is yet another example of this. The normal route through this game is probably on the moderate challenging side, maybe moderate by today's standards. If you're going for all the star special world levels, they're going to provide you with some very difficult aspects. And again, for you watching this right now, when we say difficult, we are talking about early 90s standards. We are not mentioning anything about the, again, massive number of Kaizo-inspired games that have been released. From a platforming point of view, Mario World, just like with any of the Mario games that came out after it, very responsive controls. This again is one of the most important aspects of platforming and game feel. When I push right, Mario immediately moves to the right. I press jump, Mario immediately jumps. It is as close to 1-to-1 between the player controls and Mario's reactions as you can possibly get. And so many developers over the years have messed with that formula. They'll make it feel like there's a slight delay, or that the character doesn't exactly go where you want them to. And that kind of stuff can doom a game, especially when it is reflex-driven regardless of its difficulty. Mario's level design is also another standout. This is a game that it does not get noticeably harder. And I've used this example before, that some people will think that if level 1 is a 1 out of 10 in difficulty, level 15 should be a 15 out of 10, and a 40 out of 10, and we just keep raising the difficulty up because that's part of progression. That's not right. Mario, and by extension, Super Mario World's environmental and level design, there is a specific number of elements that the game will use to test the player, from the different kinds of moving blocks, enemies, buzzsaws, spin jumps, swimming, and all that. And what the developers do is that instead of making things noticeably difficult, they do more with their kind of toolkit of hazards. In the early parts of this game, the most challenging thing may be to jump over a pit, dodge a bullet bill. But by the end of the game, the developers are basically unleashing their entire set of obstacles at you. Ice physics, that pea balloon thing, dodging chucks with their baseballs, and many more. And while this is certainly harder, it's not harder simply because they're just making the game more difficult, is that they're requiring you to make more use of or pay more attention to what the game is throwing at you. There are, of course, multiple routes, multiple secrets. And let's not, of course, forget about Mario's power-ups. Each power provides another way of tweaking how Mario behaves. Being small Mario is different than being big Mario. Using the regular jump is different than the spin jump. Cape physics, as everyone knows, Fire Flower, and all that. And it's this foundation that Nintendo said that has, again, led to such a popular use from the Kaizo community. Like I said, it is impossible at this point to tell just how far-reaching Super Mario World is to the 2D platformer genre, with so many developers who have put their own spin on this, using the likes of Kaizo hacks and Kaizo mods. I've watched a lot of them over the past 5 years now, and it is mind-boggling just how much variety they've gotten by either keeping things the same, adding in crazy new elements, the whole chocolate versus vanilla aspect, and again, all of this is built off of a platformer that came out, my goodness, what are we at, a little over 30 years ago. I feel really old now talking about this game. But again, this is one of the things I said in the first part of this video, and why Nintendo's designs had this timelessness to them that we often don't see from other developers and other studios. And you want to be able to examine this game and see just how a responsive character with a very wide, diverse kind of environment level designs, and again, keeping the camera in its best possible spot for Mario, makes this game such a joy to play. And like I said, if any one of these elements is out of alignment, it is going to hurt the game. And that is a really good segue to this point. Yeah, we're getting the console wars reignited here, as our first don't is the Sonic series. Again, specifically focusing on the 2D Sonic games. And yeah, there's going to be probably a lot of comments about this one. Sonic, again, has been the closest for over a decade to Mario's dominance of 2D platforming. Again, for people who grew up in the 90s, the whole Sega does when Nintendo don't campaign. But while Sonic tried to position itself as the cooler, hipper 2D platformer, Mario eventually caught up, outlapped, and has basically been ahead of him ever since. And this is a good example of how the camera can come back to haunt you, specifically when it comes to giving the player information. Sonic has basically staked the entire design on the act of speed. Sonic runs fast. He goes through levels at blinding speeds compared to Mario. But where this fails is with this disconnect between the level design and the camera. Anyone who has ever touched a Sonic game in the past 30 years knows that running full speed ahead without, prior playing these levels previously is a recipe for you to die. Because the camera itself does not show enough of the level in order to give the player proper feedback. When you are running full speed, Sonic moves to about the 75% or 75% of the screen from the right-hand side. At this position, you are not able to react on time to a spike, to a pit, to an enemy, whatever. And part of this, again, was done to give this illusion of speed. And there will be an example later on in this video of how you do speed far better than what Sonic ever did. And I think I may have given it away for people if you know what game I'm going to be talking about. But the Sonic design has never squared this circle of making sure that the camera can properly keep up with Sonic's movement. And the level design itself has never managed to accommodate that either. If there were actual notifications, even just the act of using ring trails so the player know, hey, maybe you should jump here and not go fall into that lava pit or that spike enemy. That would have gone a long way. And as a very interesting point, we're even seeing Kaizo designers doing that now with having different colored coins to donate. No. And as a very interesting point, we're even seeing Kaizo designers doing that now in some of the newer Mario hacks. Well, they'll use different colored coins to denote what the player is supposed to be doing. Is this a spin jump? If this is a normal jump, do you throw something here? And it's just ways of giving the player information so they have at least some idea as to what is coming up. Now, much has been talked about over years with Sonic's physics, and Sonic was perhaps the first 2D platformer to make use of a kind of simulated physics model, where it tried to simulate like realistic physics for how Sonic moved. Sonic didn't just immediately go at full speed, he needed to build it up. There were slopes and angles. And this kind of stuff, again, like to the modern like 2D designer watching this, you may think that sounds boring. But this was very revolutionary for its time. And it is one area that Mario has never managed to quite go. But there's a point for that. Again, at the end of the day, your game feel is king. It does not matter the tech you use, does not matter if you are perfectly simulating the act of a hedgehog running 600 miles per hour down a busy street. If your game doesn't control right, if it's not properly conveying the information the player needs, all that tech might as well just be thrown in the trash because the players are not going to enjoy it. And what we've seen with Sonic over the years has been this just constant attempt at reinventing how the platforming works, how the jump and movement physics behave. And it's why the Sonic games have never managed to catch up to the Mario titles. Like we've said, Nintendo has gotten their game feel down pat at this point, and it gives them the ability to then experiment and do strange new things with it that comes with the fact that they already have their foundation done. And that is another lesson for those of you watching this when it comes to game feel. That getting it right as early as you can in your game's development will make things so much easier for you. Because if you know that your physics are on point, you know exactly how your character jumps, walks, slides, whatever, you can now build very interesting levels around that. Here's another nightmare scenario for a designer watching this. You are 75% done building a game and you realize that your jump physics don't work. So you decide to change them. And then the horror show begins when you realize you now have to change every single level that you've designed up until this point. And what are we up to, like 5 heart attacks causing moments in this video. To wrap up this section, Sonic is an example of a game that, when we talk again about good platforming design, again, the combination of the camera, the level design, and the behavior and physics of the character that go with it, they are not all aligned. And there are people who will probably defend this game to the death and argue with me in the comments down below. That once you've mastered this game, once you've memorized every single path, every single ring trail, that you can really open things up in Sonic. But as we've learned, when we're talking about good game feel for the consumer base and your customer base, you want to start at a point where your game is enjoyable to play, because that's what's going to invite people to start learning more about it and start mastering it. And it's also, again, why we haven't seen more developers kind of adopt the Kaizo mindset, at least in the consumer space, as you would think, considering how much success it's had kind of growing up and also on par with that with the rise of speedrunning. But that's going to do it for our Speedy Hedgehog friend. We're not having done the first episode of the series, I'm already breaking the rules, as I have a double due for our next section, and that is Super Meat Boy and N++. Both of these games can be defined as being very physics-driven platformers. Your main characters in both do not have a lot of advanced movement tech built into the control. In Super Meat Boy, you walk, run, jump. Those are all the mechanics that you have as a character. In N++, it's very much the same thing. But where these games derive their complexity and their challenge comes from what you can do with a very limited set of verbs. In both titles, you are able to wall jump, and both games, as I said, make heavy use of a simulated physics model. As your character runs, slides, jumps, that momentum and velocity can be used to affect your trajectory, increase how fast you can run, how high you can jump, etc., etc. And both games also go for a very different kind of design that we see from games like Mario that we mentioned earlier. In Mario and most 2D platformers, the theme or challenge that you go through is the entirety of a stage. That is a stage that must have multiple kinds of obstacles. There must be a beginning, middle, and end flow to it. In these two games, however, most of these stages, I think in N++ case, every stage is a single screen. Super Meat Boy does have some larger stages, but again, when we say large in Super Meat Boy, that is maybe 40 seconds, a minute, maybe even like a minute and a half for a level. And this is a very different kind of flow and different kind of design. Again, why put these two games together? By keeping things very short and very concise, it does two things. First, it makes the level design very focused. That you go into a level, you can immediately see what your objective is, what are the obstacles, and start building the mental framework in your head as to where you have to go, where you're jumping, where you're moving, wall, sliding, and all that great stuff. The other thing this does is it reduces the frustration of difficulty. One of the more easily catchable traps that game designers can fall into is this notion of making levels very, very long, and that if you mess up at any point, there goes 3 to 5 minutes of your time. And with these two games, death is immediate, and you do not lose a lot of progress by dying. Again, in Super Meat Boy, when you die, you are down maybe a millisecond, maybe half a millisecond before you can start over again. And this cuts away at kind of that added punishment that comes with a lot of longer games, especially longer platformers, where, oh, you run out of lives and you're 75% on this level, go back to 0. And don't worry, we'll have a game that has that issue coming up next. Both games, again, also build their challenge based on the environment itself. You do not gain the upgrades in Super Meat Boy or N++. Neither game will give you the double jump power or the ability to teleport around. Instead, all the challenge and interesting gameplay comes from how the levels are shaped and what hazards are in it. It's kind of funny that both games also feature some kind of a homing missile enemy that will totally wreck your life when you first run into them. And this is where you can get a lot of mileage out of your levels, because changing the position of an enemy, changing whether you jump right to left to right, down to up to down, whatever, this provides you with a new element for your levels, a new challenge. So that, again, the player is not changing what they're doing in any level at any point in these two games, but how the level tests them, what you're actually trying to do, that changes. And it allows these games to be very friendly to modders and people making custom levels. And as another very interesting comparison, both games come with their own level editors. Both have had massive fan support in terms of designing levels in all shapes, sizes, and degrees of masochism. If you learn these two games, you'll also understand how difficulty can be in the eye of the beholder. There are people who have never managed to clear half of the first world of Super Meat Boy. And there are people who have ran through every level, gotten every challenge, done every Dark World stage, and gotten the game's true ending. And this, again, is one of the hardest things to convey, especially about reflex-driven games, and most notably about platforming design. That you're going to have this situation where the onboarding is going to be king. You have to give the player some foothold to learning your game, especially if you're going to add in simulated physics, because that is not something that most players are going to understand or realize when they first play your game or they first look at screenshots. And again, going back to the original section of this video, a lot of people, again, will assume that if you just watch footage of these games, that you'll understand everything there is to it. And these two games are proof positive that that is wrong. Simply holding down the run button versus not holding it feels like two completely different sets of movement in these games. As a follow-up, this is also something that we saw with Ultimate Chicken Horse, another favorite of mine, but not one we're going to be including on the list here. So to wrap up this section, challenging games need to have something to offset that extreme difficulty, whether it's by having limited tech for the player to learn, very short and snappy levels, or all the above. If you're trying to do it all, give me incredibly difficult levels that are massively long with 15 different kinds of jumping and dash tech and slide tech and all the other tech in the world, it can become very demanding and very much too much for a player to enjoy. When you get to that level of throwing stuff in, it almost feels like you could have built maybe 2 or 3 smaller games in time to create the every platformer. And you want, again, your games to be very lean in this respect, because reflex-driven gameplay is all about the player. If they're getting bored or they're getting frustrated, that is it. And once you lose someone like that, again, they are going to be gone for good. For our next don't, we're turning to a game that, when we talk about analyzing the design, as I've said, you want to look at the very good and the very bad examples. And Rocky and Bullwinkle for the Super Nintendo is very much a bad example. And again, I want to make this, or stress this point very clear. This is by no means an insult to anyone who worked on the game, who had any part in the game's creation. We are just talking about the merits of the game's design here. And Rocky and Bullwinkle belongs to that very magical period where licensed games were, well, uniformly bad. And again, it feels like such a long time ago for the young people listening or watching this video. What makes this game bad is not just exclusive to it. This is just the biggest example that I saw when I was doing my research for platformers. The feel of the game is completely off. Both characters just don't really jump right, and this is also translated into the level design itself, with platforms where the hit detection can be a little bit off, or cases where you just cannot see the jump you're trying to make. In the game's quote-unquote second level that takes place in this massive cave, you have to do character-wide jumps onto small platforms in a mostly black background, which means that you can't even use the background to kind of adjust your vision to see where the platforms are going when they're going to stop. And if you fail at any point in those jumps, you're going back to the start of the area. This is a game that is immeasurably frustrating to play. In the last section, I mentioned about having no punishment in your games. This game, you run out of lives and continues, and you're going all the way back to the beginning of this game. And I beat this game and I use save states, and I am very proud of that. This is a title that, again, when we talk about reflex-driven gameplay, one aspect of your controls, of your movement or jump tech are off, and the entire game will fall apart in the process. And like I said, this is not the only licensed 2D platformer to commit this sin. There are a whole lot of them during the NES and SNES era. So if you want to study kind of what not to do, You can pick up Rocky and Bullwinkle, or just look at, again, any licensed platformer that came out during the NES and SNES era, maybe going into the possible N64 PlayStation 1, and you can certainly see just how much pain there can be when it comes to platforming. For our next two, we turn to a very recent example, and this is a great game about not only the feel of movement, but also translating that into a fair and acceptable challenge, and that is Pizza Tower, a game that is certainly an homage to the era of Wario Land, where our main character, Peppino Spaghetti, must climb the massive pizza tower, running, jumping, sliding, and trying to get all those lovely toppings and collectibles in a level. The game itself, as you can see from the footage, definitely has some homages to Sonic as well. But with the improvement of frames per second, and even just the camera giving you more draw distance, or more distance as you're running, it makes it so much easier to play compared to that of Sonic. You are given more than enough leeway. Not only that, but the movement tech in this game is on the advanced side. While this game does not have as much jump tech compared to some of the other platformers mentioned in this episode, it has far more running and movement tech, as you'll need to master kind of doing this kind of like motorcycle slide to turn Peppino around, making use of wall running, the kind of super jump, dashing, and even his kind of a quasi uppercut double jump in order to get through levels. Like a lot of the best examples in this video, the level design is fantastic, with each level conforming to a very specific theme, having a unique and original song, and challenging the player in a different way. And that again is one of the major hallmarks of good reflex-driven design. Every level, every challenge should feel different, whether that difference can be measured in inches or miles or somewhere in between. Again, what the player is doing from beginning to end in Pizza Tower does not change one iota. You are not going to be given any permanent upgrades. Peppino's not going to turn into a mech at some point and anything like that. But how the level design tests the player, how the flow of the levels push the player through it, that is different in each stage. And bonus points are also featuring very memorable and very different boss fights. In a lot of platformers, oftentimes the bosses are kind of given the short end of the stick, with everyone kind of focusing more on the stage and level design. Here, the bosses act as they're almost like quasi minigame, giving you a completely different challenge to overcome, and making you feel all the more badass for doing it. This game also does what we see from a lot of the best Nintendo games, again with having advanced challenge and rewards, but still making it feel fair. Going for P rank in each one of the stages is a challenge, but it is not like an overwhelmingly like masochistic, you are going to break your fingers trying to do. Whereas with some of the other ones we've played like Crash 4, it was just painful. And perfection is one of the things you have to be very mindful of. How many of your players and your consumer base are really going to feel that drive to do it? While not everyone is certainly going to 100% P-rank Pizza Tower, the carrot on the stick is still close enough that you can at least give it a try, and you can at least get that feel for it. And it is such a great way of essentially testing and rewarding the player for mastery. And that's why this is a fantastic game to play, and again, the complete opposite of the Sonic series in terms of making speed and levels designed around that. It feels so much better in this game. And I would say that, again, if you want to look at both Sonic and Pizza Tower, play them both relatively close and see how much more responsiveness and how much more the feel of the game works for Pizza Tower compared to the 2D Sonic titles. Alright, it's time to turn to another controversial don't on this list, and oh my goodness, I'm going to get so many hateful comments down below for this one. But the next don't that I want to mention is Dustforce. And oh boy, I can just feel the comments coming at me as I'm talking right now. Dustforce is a game that once again came out during the Super Meat Boy kind of making more platformers challenging era of the early to mid 2010s. This is a game where every level is designed as a kind of obstacle course of platforming and movement tech. Your job is to clean up all the dust, trash, and trash monsters that are in a stage, do it all, get to the end, and get your medal. But you see, it's not quite that simple. Not only do you have simulated physics, much like in Super Meat Boy and N++, but you have a combo timer. And in order to get the best rating on a level, you must clean up all the trash, you must do it all within a single combo, and you cannot fail at any point in the stage, or your combo gets reset and you must restart if you want to get everything. So this is the point where one of you may say, well, what's the big deal about, having all these restrictions for getting the best rating? Well, you see, it comes out like this. In order to make actual progress in Dustforce, you are required to 100% levels. When you get through a level all the way, you'll unlock a new level. You may get like a key or some kind of reward that will then unlock a new set of levels in the main world. And the game, like right here, this is definitely a design sin to commit. And that is combining both casual and hardcore play directly into your progression. If you could have gotten like a key or gone through a lot of these areas without needing 100%, it would have at least given people some measure of reward and progress. To go back to Pizza Tower, in order to get through the game, you must collect the various toppings in each level, but you are not required to get 100% of them in each and every level to see that game all the way through to the end. Likewise, P-ranking the game is not required. And you have to be very mindful, again, of what is optional and what is required in your game. Unlike some of the other ones we mentioned, like N++ and Super Meat Boy, there is a lot of tech that goes into Dustforce. This game was clearly designed with like a speedrunner, advanced, or expert level play in mind. You have different characters. Not only does each character have their own different way of attacking, complete with range and damage, they have their different jump heights and how this relates to the movement and getting around the world. So you not only have to memorize and master each level, but you also have to figure out what is the best character to use in that level. And again, speedrunners have blown this game wide open in terms of getting through it, and they will probably be the ones to shout the praises of it. But again, the point of this video is understanding how a game feels in the hands of your general consumer, and the general consumer base bounced off of this game hard. And that is something that you want to avoid as a developer. Again, this is why you're going to have advanced challenges, advanced elements that can kind of push someone even further in. You have to be very measured with when you put that in your game and when someone can experience it. Dustforce, again, from beginning to middle to end, is built for the hardcore mindset. And that is not a good way of onboarding your game. As another point, similar to that of Sonic, the game has that same issue of representing speed and momentum. There are a lot of levels in Dustforce that feature a lot of vertical drops and slides, and because it's a simulated physics, it means that once you start moving, or once you start picking up that momentum, it's going to force you to go faster and faster. There are a lot of cases where the camera cannot keep up with the level, at least at the speed and clarity needed to make some of these jumps and motions kind of on reaction. And in order to get through some of these sections, you basically need to just go by memorization. Know that after these amount of seconds in a slide, you should jump. You need to prepare for the wall jump here. And as another point, this game features wall running that is automatic. So when you kind of hit a wall and you hit the button to wall run, your character will go without your control. And again, I cannot stress this enough, that you have to be very careful when you have elements that take the player's control away from the reflex-driven gameplay. And another example coming up in a few minutes is going to have more of that issue. But this is the point about Dustforce. It is not a bad game. This is some fantastic platforming. But it's placed so far up on a pedestal that most people who play this game, they are never going to see anything this game has to offer, and the game makes no real solid attempt to kind of guide the player through it. It is going a mile a minute from the word go. And while that is certainly fine if you're building like a Kaizo game, a very masochistically driven platformer, if you're trying to build a commercial game, something that a lot of people can play and enjoy, this is unfortunately not how you do that. For our first kind of solo do for this video, we are talking about Lunark. Lunark is a game that's in the style what I like to define as an adventure platformer. This is in the style of the Prince of Persia games or the old school ones, Oddworld's platformers, Heart of Darkness, Flashback, Out of This World, and so on. This kind of platforming is unique compared to the other entries in this video. This is not about kind of reflex focus, very movement jump tech style platforming. Instead, it is about kind of solving puzzles through jumping. The player needs to get over to X, they can move like so on. How do you facilitate that? And this has often been used for games that will typically have like a secondary system to go with the platforming, most oftentimes with shooting. In these kinds of titles, instead of the jumping being very reactive, as I said, it's more about a committed style, that once you're off the ground, the player loses all control of their character until they either hit a ledge or they land somewhere. And it makes the platforming again more puzzle-like, figuring out how to move around the environment given your limited moveset. The reason why Lunark gets it on the list here as a do is that when the game was originally like kind of shown off, demos and stuff like that, it had very much the same kind of style as all those games. And by style, I mean it can be very kind of clumsy or very kind of cumbersome to play. Because your character can only move at specific angles and jump at specific places, it means that you have to slow things down dramatically to do basic jumps. It's not a case of you just going to a ledge, jumping, your character gets it. You need to walk over to the ledge, turn around so you're facing the actual part of the ledge you can climb, jump, let the character do it, and then once he's hanging or holding that ledge, press up again to climb up. Again, this doesn't sound as bad as I'm describing it, but remember, this is constant and it's frequent in all aspects of it. And because of that, it can leave these games feeling very cumbersome to play, and it can really eat away at the player's engagement if they're not all in from the get-go. So what the developer did very wisely was add in some really smart approachability and quality of life features to the game. When you go over to a ledge now or anything, when you go to jump, your character will auto adjust, and it's kind of like a smart jump system. So you no longer have to turn and do the jump at that specific angle. If you're within the position of that ledge that you're trying to reach, the game will auto kind of make your character do a 180 while they're jumping and hit that edge. This doesn't sound all that big of a deal, but it really reduces a lot of the frustration and clumsiness that oftentimes befalls these games, and it just makes it feel all the more better to play without compromising on the more, again, like kind of thoughtful jumping rather than the reflex-driven aspect. So this is a great game to study in terms of adventure platforming style and how you can, again, kind of square those two circles of giving the player control but still testing their knowledge and how they set up the jumps more than actually making said jumps. We now turn to our next combination of do's and don'ts, and this has to do with control over your character. And the don't that I want to start with is unfortunately the game Mystic Melee. This is not the only game that has committed the sin we're going to talk about, but it is the one that has always stuck in my mind as something that can be very frustrating. So this was a game that was supposed to be like a combination of very movement-focused platforming with an almost kind of like Smash Brothers-esque combat system when you go into fighting enemies or like these arena battles. And the game has this very, and I've said this before, like very annoying kind of jump design that in most of the platforms and all the ones that we've talked about in this video so far, when you're in the air and you're able to move and adjust your character only moves when you press in that direction. And I know what I just said, it sounds very basic, but Mystic Melee, along with other platformers who like I said, I cannot remember their names off the top of my head right now, what they did was when you're in the air, your character keeps moving in that direction. So this is oftentimes what we see in kind of like simulated physics style games or platformers that are meant to be a little bit more on the floatier side. I can also see this as kind of be like an approachability feature that you don't have to always keep holding left and right, your character will just move for you. But you see, the design sin in this respect is that when it comes to reflex-driven games, the player must always be 100% in control over their character. There should be an almost one-to-one relation to button or analog stick or even mouse input to what is happening on screen. In one of the Critical Thought videos, I'll be talking more about game feel, and this is one of the biggest sticking points about it. If the player feels like they are not in control over their character, it just ruins a lot of the feel and the momentum of the game, especially if you're building your game around being very reflex-driven, very high-score mastery focus. Earlier in the video when I talked about Dustforce, the whole wall running being like this like forced element, the second you hit the wall and kind of stick to it, your character immediately runs up or down it. That is another example of this. And it's something you need to be very mindful of as a developer. And I've seen this again in a lot of games that come from people trying to combine platforming with insert genre here. That you are kind of degrading or hurting the quality of the platforming, trying to like make the other genre the focus. And even in the games like we've mentioned that are more adventure platforming, like Lunark in the last section, the player, once they've made that decision to hit the jump button, the run button, whatever, the character will respond accordingly. This is not about kind of super tech-driven platforming, where your character is going to be, or your player is going to be making dozens of micro adjustments every few seconds, such as in a Meat Boy or N++. It is the idea that if I want the character to do something, I want the game to only recognize my controls, not have anything automatic. And again, when we talk about like automatic features and stuff like this also kind of segues into accessibility and approachability features, which are not the focus of today's video. But if you're trying to build anything that is reflex driven, if you want to have auto features like that, make it an optional feature for your game. But if you're trying to appeal to someone who plays platformers, shooters, anything that's action driven, they need to be in control, or the whole thing can just come off not feeling right to the player. And now we turn to a very obvious do, and one I'm sure you've all been expecting it to show up at some point in this video, and that is Celeste. Celeste is like by far, in my opinion, one of the hardest 2D platformers commercially released. Again, we're not going to be including Kaizo games and Kaizo hacks in this list here. But what makes Celeste like the perfect complement to our last game, and to the discussion about control, is that this is a game that entirely puts the player's success or failure in their hands. Now, as another interesting point about Celeste, and going back to when I talked about N++ and Super Meat Boy, that Celeste has its kind of own abstracted physics system, but it is not as simulated physics as those other games. When you go to make a jump and a dash, there is a very specific velocity and angle that your character can jump. This is important for two reasons. One, it lets the player build in their mind the exact angles that they can make and reach on any given screen. The second thing, it cuts down on the game being like on the jankier side, or when it feels like the player is not, once again, in complete control over how their character behaves. A lot of developers have used simulated physics with very additional movement tech, like air dashing, ground slides, and so on. And what can end up happening is that when you have the simulated physics combined with very rapid fire movement tech, it can make it very unpredictable to the player as to how are they going to actually jump when they hit that dash or slide or run or whatever button. And Celeste doesn't have that issue. While this game has a lot of advanced tech to it, none of that tech is kind of built into the button pressing or the control scheme itself. It's just figuring out how you use the physics of the game to do different kinds of jump and different kinds of moving around. And that does not in any way downgrade the difficulty of it. Celeste is always on the higher than normal side of difficulty from beginning to end. It just gets even more advanced as you get further in, especially if you're going for the seaside challenges. Now, to the last point about having approachability and accessibility features, Celeste is also famous for being kind of one of the first games to really display that front and center. That you could play this game without any of those options, you will have pain and you are going to be challenged for it. Or you could play this game with invincibility, infinite jumps, all that, and the game does not acknowledge it either way. Now, there's certainly a debate about whether or not you should have an achievement or, the you beat the game on hardcore mode reward in it. But this is a great way of having your cake and eat it too. There are people who love Celeste for its story, for its characterizations, and where it all leads, and could care less about getting all the strawberries, getting all the hearts, doing all that stuff. And there are people who have gotten every strawberry, they have completed every challenge, I'm sure someone has probably done a no-death run in this game at some point. And the brilliance of Celeste is that it is set up to allow both ends of the spectrum to enjoy this game. And again, on top of being a very fantastically made 2D platformer, there are a lot of fantastic obstacle designs, environmental challenges, and once again, it is a game where the character themselves, in terms of what they can do, it does not change all that much. Now, this game does have a very rare exception. Now, you do unlock the ability to kind of double jump, double dash near the end of it. But that is only used for specific levels. It is not like a Metroidvania where you unlock, now you get the super air dash and the super jump and all that. Instead, again, it's all built on a very set foundation of mechanics and movement. And then the world itself is built and expanded to add more to those elements. This is the kind of game you should study if you're looking, again, for very challenging design while giving the player all the tools they need. If I had any issues in terms of design with Celeste, is that the camera does have some issues in some of the vertical sections in terms of keeping up and showing the player where things are going to be coming up. And you do need a little bit of memorization in some of those areas, especially if you're trying to do the Farewell DLC and its kind of final challenge. And that final challenge is, again, the closest I think we will see a commercial game actually turning into a Kaizo game at the very end. But still, a game that holds up very well. There are multiple mods. There's even Kaizo mods for Celeste. So definitely wrap your mind around that one. And if you're up for a challenge and wanting to make a challenging game, then you should be studying this one. It's time for the final category for this episode. And I have no idea if the future episodes will be as long as this one. But this is one of the biggest design sins that you can commit when it comes to any reflex-driven game. And it's a sin you may not see it coming. And the example that I am pulling for today is Kazi and the Wild Masks. This is a game that, and I want to make this very clear, this is not a bad platformer. There is nothing that I would say is off about. The platforming is solid, great aesthetic, great art style. So why am I mentioning this in the don't column? Well, you see, it commits one of the worst sins you could imagine as a video game could do, even worse than all the abusive monetization and pay-to-wins that are out there. It commits the sin of just being a good game. Yes, I know I just said that. You see, one of the major aspects of reflex-driven design is that there has to be not only a kind of the standard progression of play. I'm on level 1, I go to level 2, I go to level 3. There has to be gameplay progression. To return to Super Mario World at the very beginning, Super Mario World, and even going to Pizza Tower as well, these are two games where every level, in some way, shape, or form, introduces a slight or major twist to the gameplay. You are not doing the 100% same exact thing level by level. And you see, this, my friends, is one of the biggest traps I've seen many indie developers fall into. That they go for quantity instead of quality. Every level feels very much like the level before it. Yes, the platforms may be different. Maybe instead of flying dodo birds, we're dealing with flying bats. Or instead of spikes on the ground, it's lava or acid, or insert your favorite environmental obstacle here. But the tech that the player is doing, what the game is challenging the player level by level, remains the same. And like I said, Kaze and the Wild Mask is not a bad game. I want to stress that point here. But again, it's a game that once you've played one level, you have technically played all the levels. And even if there is a level somewhere in the middle or near the end that mixes things up, that changes the script in some way, it comes too little too late to keep engagement. And when I looked at the achievement page for Kaze on Steam, about 50% of the player base stopped playing before they finished World 1. And when I stopped the game, it was down to about like the 28th or 30th percentile. And I want to make this very clear. I didn't play this game for like 5 to 10 hours. I think I played it for about an hour to 90 minutes. And you see, this is why the sin of being an okay game matters. Because you can have a beautiful aesthetic, a great foundation of your platforming, your movement tech, but if your game doesn't go anywhere with it, if it doesn't make it its own, people are not going to stick with that game. Like we've said time and time again, the era in which you could say, hey, my game features 500 hours of gameplay, 7,000 levels for you to go through, that's not a marketing point anymore. Today, people want quality instead of quantity. If you can create 20 amazingly different and unique levels, where each level is entirely a one-off in terms of your design, that is going to stick with the player more than saying, here's 60 almost identical levels, and even again that the platforming is good, that it feels great to play. The game is not doing enough to be memorable to the player. It's not taking its inspirations and its design and making it its own. And these games can still sell reasonably well. But the issue is getting people to come back for your next game, and the game after that, and so on. Because if they don't remember anything about your last game, or they remember that they just kind of went, and they stopped playing, what's a chance that they're going to be there day one, week one, month one for your game? They may play it eventually if they get it for free in a Humble Bundle or get it as part of some package. Maybe it goes down to 75, 90% off. But those people or that market of the consumer is not going to be your fans. They're not going to be the people who are going to be there to support you immediately. And that is something that every game and every developer needs. And again, I can give you even more depressing examples of just okay games. And this is just in platforming. Trust me, there are just okay games in every genre and every color of the rainbow that's out there. So with Kazi, what I want you to look at if you do decide to play this one is I want you to study that where or does this game do anything different with its levels. And before anyone leaves a comment down below, I also want to throw another, like a spike or twist the knife a little bit more. Having the quote-unquote underwater level or underwater section is not enough of a design break or changing the mechanics. There has to be more to it than just, here's the ground level, here's the air level, here's the water level, and scene. And to that point, we have yet another, I guess, double do to counter the previous don't. And the first one I want to mention is a game that should be recognizable to every one of you watching this. If you are interested in platforming design, you have not heard or played Shovel Knight, then you are really behind the times. Shovel Knight is a game that has gone on to almost universal acclaim. It has become an IP franchise onto itself, with the characters licensed out to other studios, making different kinds of games. It was part of kind of like a puzzle game, a kind of Downwell inspired one, and I'm sure there's even more out there. The character has even been licensed to other properties, such as appearing in Smash. So Shovel Knight itself is a game that, as you're watching this footage, you can tell that this was inspired by the NES 8-bit era of platforming. This is a game that wears its platforming inspirations on its blue armor, whatever is the version of sleeves for armor. But you see, here's what this game does that many indie developers have tried and have failed to do. And that is take their inspirations and make it their own design. Shovel Knight is a game that again combines aspects of DuckTales, Mega Man, even a lot of the old school like 2D action platforms, like especially some of the Disney style ones, or I should say the Capcom design ones based off Disney games during that 8-bit era. This is a game that what they do with it is take that inspiration and then build on it. Shovel Knight features many unique elements that weren't in those original games, such as being able to choose how you access checkpoints or break the checkpoints for more rewards. The whole kind of overworld map to explore for bonus fights, bonus items, upgrades, and etc. This was also extended when they released their other kind of Knight games, such as having Plague Knight with being able to like create different kinds of effects with his bombs, a King Knight with being an actual like quote unquote like deck builder, and I think it was like Ghost Knight or Undead Knight, I forget his name, but the one that was very movement, kind of grinding on rails kind of design. And again, nothing that Shovel Knight did individually was unique. All these aspects have been featured in other games and other genres in some way, shape, or form. But the developers didn't stop at just saying, well, if game A did this, let's just throw it into our game. No, they want to make it their own element within Shovel Knight. Once again, Shovel Knight is a game that is very lean in its design. This is not a 30 to 60 hour long game. But what it is a game where every level is original, every item, power-up, upgrade adds something to the game, and once again, it feels really good to control and play. And it's why, again, that it is a game that succeeded and deservedly so, and has become kind of the banner for Yacht Club games. And if they ever decide to make a sequel, it'll be very interesting to see where they go with it. But when you're studying Shovel Knight, look at all the mechanics. Look at how these things have been used before, but look at how they have done things on their own. How they made them original. From how Shovel Knight moves and attacks, to the various bosses slash knights slash robot masters that you play in it. And then look at the additional games, which I don't know they're like, we consider them expansions or just like standalone or side games within the Shovel Knight gameplay, and see how they were able to take the basic foundation of Shovel Knight and once again kind of head off in a different direction and build an entire character around that. And because I always like to have very unique end games that you may not have heard of in these video series or anything that I talk about with video games, the kind of companion to Shovel Knight in terms of original and growing the gameplay from beginning to end, I want to mention is Tiny Thor. Tiny Thor is a 2D platformer that it starts out very unassuming. It looks like a game much like with something like with Kaze and some of the other platforms I play that they're not really going to do much with it. Your character is Tiny Thor. He throws a hammer, it acts as a boomerang. Here are some basic levels that do that. And I'm sure there are people who may have quit Tiny Thor within maybe 20 to 40 minutes thinking that this is just like some very basic, some very like casual 2D platforming. But then the game opens up, and as you go through Tiny Thor, you are given permanent upgrades. Now, this is not a case of being a Metroidvania. We'll do a Metroidvania entry at some point if people like this series. The upgrades, once they're introduced, are just kind of integrated into the rest of the game, and you're not required to go back to earlier levels with those upgrades. But what the upgrades do, and almost like a sinister twist by a developer, is that it affords them the ability to raise the complexity of the game up. Once you get introduced to abilities such as being able to double jump, being able to kind of do like these kinds of dashings as well, adding more combat tech with how your hammer behaves, and so on, these elements are folded into the levels, and the level design gets progressively more complex and more challenging. What you do in level 1 of Tiny Thor is nothing compared to what you do in the final world of that game and the kind of bonus platforming challenges. As a bonus point, I also want to give credit to the developers for having these kinds of action puzzle platforming. This is not the same as Lunark and adventure platforming, but the game requires you to perform some very interesting maneuvers using the physics and Thor's hammer to do some advanced challenges, and that could like be its own like game within a game itself. Now, with that said, I would certainly put Tiny Thor as a harder platformer than Shovel Knight is. And if you're trying to learn, or what you want to learn from Tiny Thor, is how different mechanics, how different elements can be integrated and should be integrated if they're put into your game into the level design itself. It obviously doesn't make sense to have platforms that require a double jump if the player hasn't unlocked that ability. But in terms of variety, again, that every level, once you start adding in these new mechanics, it starts to feel like different things. It doesn't feel like you're just going through the same level again and again and again. You're going to be legitimately tested differently throughout the game. And while there is certainly a point to argue that compared to games like Super Mario World and Celeste, who kind of give you everything right from the get-go, and we could certainly argue that there is a point that when we look at games again like Super Mario World and Celeste, that they give you all the movement tech and all the major platforming abilities from the get-go, that Tiny Thor may play a little bit too close to the vest. Like I said, the first world, or kind of like the first major grouping of levels in the game, it doesn't give you that sense that this game is going to get difficult. But like I said, for the people who stuck with it, it is one of the more challenging 2D platforming games released. And certainly one, again, that's worth studying in terms of how you can add new abilities to your game, how the levels can grow and change. And that is another really important point. If you study one of the starting levels in Tiny Thor and how the platforms are set up, obstacles are set up, gaps, and so on, when you go to one of the end levels in the game, the entire philosophy of how all that is put in is completely different, because the levels have to be adjusted to accommodate the new abilities. That is, again, something that you want to do in any kind of reflex-driven game, that the game and the world have to respond to what the player can and can't do at any moment. And with all that, this video is finally done. And I am very sure that a few of you are getting ready to write some comments down below saying, well, you didn't cover so-and-so, and this game is famous because of X, and why didn't you talk about this one, and this is my favorite platform, and it's the greatest one in the world, and how dare you not mention it? But, like I said, this is meant to be a series looking at some of the major and important angles of each genre. And many of the games that I'm sure are some of your favorites will still have aspects that we covered here. But as with any of these videos, let me know what some of your favorite or not so favorite 2D platformers in the comments down below. Did they do something that was different or something that was worth talking about in this video series? Let me know, and of course, do the YouTubing stuff. If you would like to suggest what will be the next genre I should cover, I'm going to try to get to them all if people like the series, but let me know as well. And with that said, thanks for tuning in. That's going to do it for today's video. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to do the YouTubing stuff people tell you to do. you're interested in more of my thoughts on design, check out my books wherever they are sold. Visit our Discord and Patreon, and come back for daily discussions on game design here, and on game wisdom, where you some of the art and science of games.